All right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for waiting. Welcome to the first session of the Forced Displacement and Urban Management Conference 2021. This is a panel discussion on urban refugee management, and the panel is organized by RDI UREF, a research group under Resilience Development Initiative, or RDI, which is a think tank based in Indonesia that is focusing on resilience. I am Akino Tahir, your host for the session. As you have probably known, the majority of forcibly displaced population live in urban areas, and cities are the hubs for mobilization, transit, and destination for all of us, including the displaced population. In this panel, we will talk about good practices of urban humanitarian responses, management for refugees in urban areas, especially those living in transitory contexts in places with limited regulation and acknowledgement of the refugee rights, and also exploring what that looks like in a country like Indonesia. I would like to remind you to check the conference website for the opening plenary that includes welcoming remarks from the organizers and 2 keynote speeches from UN Habitat Asia Pacific and APRAN, the Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network. Now, before I introduce our panelists today, a bit of housekeeping. First of all, participants, you can post questions and comments at the Q&A feature at Zoom. You can also vote the questions similar to the ones you want to ask. So those questions can stay at the top and more likely to be chosen. And then next, please fill out the attendance and feedback form. The links are provided later through the chat section by our team. And then last, the summary of our discussion today will be raised in the closing plenary on Thursday afternoon. So make sure that you join the session. But also, we may post your questions and comments in our social media, so do follow us. All right, now I would like to welcome all our speakers for today. I think if possible, maybe all speakers can open their video so people can recognize their faces. We have 4 amazing speakers today. We have the first one is Professor David Sanderson from the University of New South Wales, Australia. We have Dr. Eni Suprapto, who is a leading Indonesian scholar on international refugee law. We also have Muaz Al-Takruri from UNHRC Indonesia and Gading Gumilang Putra from GRS Indonesia. Welcome, David, Pak Eni, Muaz, and Mas Gading to the panel today. I'm very, very much looking forward for our discussion today. Now, we have about 10 to 15 minutes of presentation for each speaker, and then we will open the Q&A session at the end of it. Perhaps can I ask David, are you already in the room?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, very good morning to you. All right, so first of all, maybe let me just introduce a little bit of you to the audience. The first speaker for today is Professor David Sanderson. David is the lead of the Institute of Global Development at UNSW Australia. Previously, he worked for CARE International, and he was a director of CENDEP, a center at Oxford Brookes University, focusing on development and emergencies. And also, he was a full-time visiting professor at Harvard University. David has more than 30 years of experience working across the world in development and emergency, and has been a member of several NGO boards and committees, including CARE International, Norwegian Refugee Council, and the Humanitarian Innovation Fund. And you can refer to the conference booklet for his full bio. Okay, David, so 10 minutes of presentation, more or less. I will give you a reminder about 2 minutes before your time is up. Yeah, over to you.
Thank you, Kino, and thank you very, very much for the opportunity to speak here. It's humbling to be part of such an important event and to speak. Gosh, there's so much to say. Hey, in fact, for something else, I was just looking at the Sustainable Development Goals and how COVID has knocked over us meeting a lot of them. An extra 200+ million people in unemployment now. Poverty is going up, and I know this is not the immediate context of what we're talking about, but we are living in a new time that COVID has knocked us over. But of course, COVID is not the only tragic game in town. And as we know, violence, conflict, climate change and disasters, not least those fueled by climate change, are those that cause people to flee, sometimes in fear for their lives, or very often, in fact, and become internally displaced people if they're in the country they're from, or as refugees if they cross a border. And as we know, people struggle, and it's complex, it's intractably complicated. And I'm always nervous and hesitant to say almost anything, because there are so many different ways to see this and to cut it. That said, that's not a counsel of despair where we don't know anything, because that's not true. This is about urban people displaced to urban areas, and as we know around the world, most people who are forcibly displaced end up in towns and cities. No one really knows. One best estimate is 60%. It's as high as 90% in the Middle East, in Jordan, and probably higher in other countries. So it's very high. For those, there'll be people on this call who may have forcibly migrated. I've never been in such a terrible position, but I can only guess that I would head for a town or a city compared to a refugee camp, because I have a right to the city. Not all countries uphold rights, by the way, but of course there are opportunities. That said, complicated, difficult, no real answers. You mentioned the good practice review that I was fortunate enough to be part of a couple of years ago, overseen by the Overseas Development Institute and the think tank ALNAP, and that good practice review is out there. We looked at what is good practice of all kinds of humanitarian response in urban areas, not least thinking about those who are forcibly migrated. And a summary of that was the forced migration review, and I just re-looked at that. And there are really three key points to try and pull out that the forced migration review piece talked about. Palestine in the late 40s have lived entire lifetimes and generations living in Amman and Jordan and elsewhere in so-called refugee camps, which are actually part of the city if you actually see them. And so for those thinking to respond and to think, it is thinking the long term. And easy for me to say, hard to do, especially if host countries may be overwhelmed and already struggling in order to, in fact, even look after their own populations. That said, those arriving in cities provide skills and opportunities and brains trusts and others, those from Syria who fled to other countries in the Middle East, by and large very well educated with lots of skill sets. That said, if you arrive in another country as a refugee, you may not be allowed to work. And so the Norwegian Refugee Council and others over the years have called for the rights to work in the city for refugees. Easy to say, actually not that hard to do and very important, because then what happens if you don't have the right to work is that you may just take jobs for half the salary in the black market, and then you struggle. So thinking long term, also about rentals as opposed to in sheds or shacks or temporary shelters, which can become ghettos very quickly. If we're thinking about the city, supporting rental markets, and there are examples of UN Habitat and again NRC and other big NGOs working to work with those who own properties to upgrade them in order to rent out at favorable rates to refugee families. Again, no real easy answer to that. Now, I do recall being in Jordan talking to a project manager about that, about the rather obvious question of when the funding ends, what happens? And they were moved to tears, of course, because there's nothing straightforward about this. That permanent impermanence and that complexity. And that brings me on to my second of the 3 points, just to try and package this in a not too long-winded, rambling manner, is that, to state the obvious again, but it's important to say that cities are incredibly complex. There are systems of governance, there are gangs, there are layers, there's good and there's bad, there are jobs, there's formal, informal, there's verticality, systems, all those things, electricity, gas. And I say that to compare with how the aid system was originated and has worked for decades, about certainly refugee camps, where camps are organized, have their own complexities. Please don't think I'm suggesting otherwise, but have a different way. And bringing that mindset and that work set of organizations used to working that to the city, different story. So if you want to visit one family working in your caseload as an NGO worker, you've got to jump in your car and drive 50 minutes to the edge of the city to talk to one family in a very humble dwelling somewhere, as opposed to talking to 30 families engaged in a meeting in a refugee camp. So it's a different thing. So the point is to engage in complexity, not to ignore, not to be lost in it. And there are ways to do that. Systems thinking is a way of doing that, seeing the connectedness of how life is. And that doesn't mean you solve everything, but it means whatever interventions you make are aware of the complexity of the city. So if it's water and sanitation and hygiene, it may not only be a bore, hole or a well, important though that is, but it's actually thinking about the water systems and everything else and employment and bottled water and all those different ways. So cities offer complexity and opportunities, but also are, may I state the obvious, complex. And that brings me to the second bit of the second point, which is actually a people-centered approach. In the good practice review, good practice is around that. Also, we put that into, in fact, the sphere standards around thinking about minimum standards in recovery, the globally used system. We produced about a year ago an urban version of that, an urban companion. And it was about a people-centered approach, never forgetting that, because that's what the ACE system is based on. So there's this duality, if you like, this tension of complexity of cities and people. And there are ways to engage and to think, an approach which is thinking about that. And my third brief point, takeaway, if you like, is a collaboration. Then, of course, we need to collaborate and work. And again, I know this sounds a bit obvious, but too often thinking about aid interventions, if you like, if not planning for the long term, the risk is to charge in and bulldoze in. And certainly a lot of post-disaster recovery is that. We need to work with councils, especially in the driving seat of that, think about education. If you take over schools for noble good uses, actually you're stopping people and children getting educated in the long term. That's one of the problems, of course, of especially children and refugee families falling out of the education system. So there's needs to plug into that. And so my final point there is collaboration engagement. And that also means, of course, working in neighborhoods, a whole of neighborhood approach, which UN agencies and others have long done. Of course, not finding individuals who may be refugee families, and you risk stigmatizing if you're doing that. A lot of people want to be hidden in the city, actually engaging in a more sort of, can I use the word holistic, more engaged with the families around those who may be refugee families. So I may have used my 10 minutes up there. Those are starting point thoughts, and happy to discuss more, and looking forward very much to listening to the other presenters on this important panel. So thank you.
Thank you very much, David. I've got a few points that I want to ask you later on. Okay, so we'll come back to you with some questions later on. Now I would remind the participants to please write your questions as well on the Q&A sections, so we can ask David later on. The next one up is Pak Eni Suprapto. As I mentioned before, Pak Eni is one of the leading scholars of international refugee law in Indonesia. He was a member of Ethics Council in National Commission Against Violence Against Women until 2020. He is also an activist in the promotion and development of refugee law, and also a human rights defender. He has published 180 writings, that's so much, relating to refugees, IDPs, human rights, and gross violations of human rights, international relations, and so on. He also worked as a protection officer in UNHRC in Geneva from 1974 until 1978. Now, Pak Eni's lecture is pre-recorded, so we are going to play some part of the video now, but you can watch the full video through the link in our website, which our lovely team member have copied in the chat section, I believe. And in this part that we are going to play, Pak Eni speaks about ASEAN and the issue on regulation pertaining to refugees and asylum seekers in Indonesia, as well as the way ahead as he sees it. So Pak Eni is here with us as well, I believe. So don't worry, he will answer your questions directly later on. Now, can I ask admin please to play the video? Thank you.
Talking about the situation in Asia, we may, as you all know, of the 10 members of the 10 member states of ASEAN, only 2 are parties to the convention and protocol, namely Cambodia and the Philippines. Indonesia is not expected to accede to the convention or protocol. Efforts have been made since all this 40 years ago, since 1981, but there is no indication that Indonesia would accede to the 2 instruments. Nor does Indonesia have a national law on refugees. In the context of ASEAN, it may be mentioned that ASEAN, as a sub-regional organization, does recognize the right of everyone to seek and receive asylum in another state in accordance with the laws of such state and applicable international instruments. This provision is contained in the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration of 2012. The stipulation that reads, in accordance with the laws of such state, reflects the position of ASEAN member states that they do not want to have an ASEAN sub-regional instrument on asylum and refugees. Indonesia does have a legislation on technical, operational, and administrative aspects of the handling of the problem of asylum seekers and refugees, namely the President Regulation 125 of 2016. It is enacted to implement the provision of Law Number 37 of the 1999 of Foreign Relations, which stipulates that the principle of policy on refugees shall be set forth in the President's decree, now called Presidential Regulation, which the enactment of Law Number 10 of 2004 as amended by law on the same subject, number 12 of 2011. To be noted, however, that Presidential Regulation 125 of the year 2016, I just referred to, does not spell out the principles of policy on refugees as required by Law Number 37 of the year 1999, Article 27, Paragraph 2. The President Regulation 125 of 2016 stipulates in fact, administrative, technical, and operational provision on the handling of refugees, not on principles of policy on refugees as meant by Law Number 37 of 1999 on foreign relations. Legislation on the principles of policy on refugees to be enacted to follow up on Law Number 37 of 1999 was intended to fill a lacuna in Indonesia's legislation on refugees, considering that Indonesia did not at the time and does not have at present national law on refugees. There is no indication, as I mentioned earlier, that Indonesia would accede to the 1951 Convention and or 1967 Protocol. To be further noted that the provision of Article 26 and Article 27 of Law Number 37 of 1999 on foreign relations have been, in fact, in the meantime, superseded by the provision of Article 28 of Law Number 39 of 1999 on human rights and Article 28G, Paragraph 2 of the 1945 Constitution, amended the Second Amendment of 2000, which recognized the right of everyone to asylum. Accordingly, the legislation which should be enacted would be Law on Asylum and Refugees to implement the provision of the relevant provision of the Constitution as amended and Law Number 39 of 1999 on human rights, which would elaborate in more details the basic principles relating to asylum and refugees. The relevant technical, operational, and or administrative regulation could be spelled out in lower level legislation such as government regulation or presidential regulation. Now, what would be the refugee situation in the future, and what would be the appropriate response to face such situation? I think we are now, the international community at present is faced and will be facing the following realities. The first reality is that the number of asylum seekers and refugees will continue to rise, not diminish. neighboring countries of the countries of origin of the asylum seekers and refugees will continue to be burdened by the influx of asylum seekers and refugees. Less and less asylum seekers and refugees would be admitted by the countries of destination. In most cases, voluntary, safe, and dignified repatriation could not take place because the root causes of problems continue to prevail, namely persecution, internal armed conflict, violence, insecurity, terrorism, gross and or persistent gross violation of the human rights laws. And in this context, it might happen that in the case of Afghanistan, to mention one example, voluntary returnees might have to forced to leave their country again to become a refugee for the second time. More and more asylum seekers and refugees has become unwanted de facto resident in the first countries of asylum. In view of the rather bleak forecast of the situation as I just referred earlier, the international community should be prepared to face the worst case scenario. That the problem of refugees will become worse in the future. The majority of them would have to stay permanently in the first country of asylum. And then the first country of asylum would have to continue to host them for a long period of time or even permanently. And the last is that humanitarian the world is at present facing a crisis of humanitarian nature as a result of the continued refugee problem, which could not be solved satisfactorily through the basic classic ways, namely voluntary repatriation, local integration, or resettlement in a third country. Nonetheless, the problem of refugees are essentially of a humanitarian nature. To solve, at least partly, the problem, the following humanitarian approach may be considered. First, traditional countries of destination would continue to take refugees for permanent resettlement, even though for a reduced number. Number two, non-destination and non-first asylum countries would offer possible admission to refugees. Number three, non-destination countries or countries of first asylum would allow refugees concerned, or at least part of them, to settle permanently in the countries concerned. Number four, voluntary, safe, and dignified repatriation would continue to be promoted, considering that the right to leave one's country and return thereto is a part of human rights. And finally, as the problem of refugees is of concern to the international community as a whole, those countries which do not admit refugees, either temporarily or permanently, would continue to contribute financially for the international efforts to seek possible solution to the problem of refugees. The 91 Convention and 1967 Protocol are the most basic important of international refugee law. They are international instruments of peace and cooperation. Despite their shortcomings, they continue to be the most useful as a framework to promote international cooperation to deal with the problem of refugees. Accordingly, states which have not as yet become parties thereto should accede to those instruments. And at the same time, countries which have no national law with respect to asylum seekers and refugees, such as Indonesia, are recommended to make one which would respond to the new situation of refugees by taking into account the new root causes the refugee, the problem of refugees. I thank everybody, and I hope this would be a very humble contribution for the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pak Eni, for recording this video. Pak Eni have presented quite detailed account about the regulations in Indonesia, which I find quite interesting. Yeah. Yeah, and I think the interesting part for me is that it shows quite a common problem in our system in Indonesia, which is the mismatch between different regulations and also what is needed or not necessarily needed by those on the ground. But anyway, a reminder to everyone that you can access the full video of Pak Eni's lecture in the link in the chat section that our team member has shared. And also, you can also visit our conference website for this panel. Another reminder is to ask your questions to David and Pak Eni through the Q&A sections. I saw that there are already 2 questions actually, and one has been answered by David, but we'll come back to that, these questions later on. I now would like to move on to the next speaker, which is Muaz Al-Takruri from UNHCR Indonesia. Muaz is a protection officer for UNHCR Indonesia. He joined the UNHCR in 2010, and previously he worked for other UN agencies, national and international non-governmental organizations, mainly in human rights, in refugee protection, and community engagement. Interesting. Muaz holds a master's degree in human rights and democratizations and a bachelor's degree in political science. So Muaz, please open your video. You have about 10 minutes, so I'll give you a reminder about 2 minutes before your time is up. So over to you.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Aquino. I'm really glad to be part of this esteemed panel indeed, and these very knowledgeable speakers indeed. I really enjoyed listening to the highlights they provided and their presentations. My presentation will be a bit general. I will talk about highlights of the urban refugees. It will be most like an introductory to the subject. Let me share my screen first, please. Are you able to see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right. So the outlines of my presentation will be the first part. In the 10 minutes, I divided it into 4 main parts. Let's say the first one is the introduction. In the introduction, I'll try to give an overview of the general refugee situation, and a big part of it was already covered by the previous esteemed speakers. In the second part, I will highlight some issues related to camps and urban settings from different point of views, from the government and the refugees themselves and the UNHCR point of view. And then I will touch base on the UNHCR policy on refugee protection and solutions for urban refugees. It's known as the UNHCR 2009 policy. And then I will highlight some specific points related to refugee children mentioned in the UNHCR 2029 policy. At the moment, we have more than 80 million people around the world have fled their homes. And among those, we have nearly 26 million who are refugees. And let me here also highlight that the difference between those who fled their homes and who became refugees. As we know, until you cross the international borders, you will be considered as an internally displaced person. And once you are across the borders, you are probably a refugee. And among those, nearly 26 million refugees in the world, half of them are children. And those children of today are the adults of the future, and that's why they require a greater attention from the UNHCR and from all other stakeholders. Here I'm presenting some figures, a glance information on the situation in the world today. As we see, around 21 million of the world's refugees are under UNHCR mandate, around 6 million of them under other UN agency, which is the UNRWA, and those are the Palestinian refugees. The number of internally displaced people, IDPs, is around 50 million, and we have around 4 million asylum seekers. Coming to Indonesia, in Indonesia we have around 13,500,000 individual refugees. 27 of them are children, and 71% are adults, and around 2% are elderly POCs. And they are scattered in the huge country of Indonesia. They are found in Medan, in Pekanbaru, in Batam, in Jakarta, in East Java, in Kupang, in Papua, in Sulawesi, Makassar, and many other places across the country. And you can imagine what that requires in terms of providing services to those refugees. It's something we are going to cover in a minute. Most of the studies, when they discuss the refugee or studies related to refugees, usually establish a clear difference between refugee in camps and refugees in urban settings. That's why I thought it's good maybe to touch base on this and to present the different views of those involved in this matter. Usually host governments would prefer to put refugee in camps, majority of governments, and from their point of view, camps would provide and would offer a basic protection, basic physical protection at least. It's easily to provide services to those camps. The international community, all the efforts of the international community will be directed to one place and in a more efficient way. It's easier to also I mean, it's easier for the government, from the government review to isolate those who are considered troublemakers. And let me explain a little bit more here. In some situations, there could be, in war zones, for example, there could be combatants among refugees, and governments, from their security point of view, would like to isolate them from the beginning and away from the communities. Also, logistically, too many refugees arriving in big numbers to cities might add pressure on the services, usually under or overstretched services, such as health, transportation, cleaning, education, and other services in the host country. From the refugee point of view, there are advantages to live in urban settings. There is a greater possibility for income generation and employment. There is a better access to a wide range of services, including local education and health at the same level provided to local or nationals. And there is more chances of integration in the urban setting. However, despite those opportunities, many urban refugees families would share difficulties. Usually they arrive in already underserved areas, in low-income areas within the city, and besides the challenges are already faced by the nationals, they also face other challenges. Those refugees usually will have to take care of themselves. Usually in camps, the assistance provided is more sufficient for refugees in most of the cases. It's hard for them to get employed and to generate incomes and access to services, usually due to several barriers, including lack of documentation, for example. Some of them can find accommodation, but many of them will rely on friends and other family members for living. And some of them, unfortunately, will end up homeless in the streets. And they will face other protection risks, including a risk of arrest and detention by law enforcement, refoulement, and that's the forcibly return of a asylum seeker or refugee to their country, harassment, exploitation, discrimination, xenophobia, inadequate or overcrowded shelter, and vulnerability to gender-based violence, health risks, and sometimes also human smuggling or human trafficking. Unfortunately, in some situations, these difficulties are even extreme in urban settings that forces some refugees to demand to be put in camps. This was the case in South Africa and Pretoria, where some refugees demanded to be returned to camp following some attacks on them from xenophobic individuals. Now let me talk a little bit about UNHCR position on this subject. Previously, UNHCR focused on refugees accommodated in camps. And this approach was encouraged by the 1997 policy statement in refugees and urban areas. This policy revealed several difficulties in serving refugees, including the growing cost of assisting refugees in urban areas. Also at that time, the understanding was that refugee or urban refugees is an exception, not the norm. However, this position, it changed swiftly or dramatically with the issuance of UNHCR policy of 2009, sorry. And that policy, UNHCR recognized the need to address the issue of refugees more comprehensively. And since that area, the body literature of urban refugees has been growing. And in the beginning of 2010, UNHCR published a series of evaluations of urban refugees operating in various countries. In 2012, UNHCR created an urban refugee steering group. And in the Bureau, UNHCR Bureau in Asia, we recently completed a regional analysis of urban refugees in 9 of the countries covered by this bureau. UNHCR change in position was in fact a reflection to the reality that half of the refugees globally living in urban areas. And as mentioned by David in the beginning, in some countries, this number rise to around 90% of those refugees living in urban settings, including Jordan, for example. Globally, there is a trend of urbanization. In 1950, around or less than 30% of the population were living in cities and towns, and it's expected to reach 60% by 2030, and the number is growing as you see in the figures here. So it's no surprise that the growing number and proportion of the world's refugee will be found in urban areas. As mentioned, most of the refugees currently living in urban areas, and the number is increasing. Going back to the UNHCR 2009 policy, there are main principal objectives in the policy, significant highlights from this policy. The first one is the policy ensures that cities are recognized as legitimate places for refugees to reside and exercise their rights, and to maximize the protection space available to urban refugees and the humanitarian organizations that supporting them. And this policy, UNHCR started to promote a model of self-reliance. Again, assisting those refugees directly from the humanitarian aid is something very challenging. So the new model was to promote self-reliance, but this is often faced by pushback from governments. Governments in many situations, they do not see refugee employment or income generating activities or self-reliance activities as an opportunity, but probably they say it as competing in the labor market, adding to the usually unemployment issues faced in these countries. And this one of the main advocacy of this policy to change the proposition of government. This policy also expanded the protection space by recognizing that the rights of refugees are not affected by their location or the means whereby they arrived in an urban areas, or their legal status, or if they are recognized under the national legislation as refugees or not. Urban areas are legitimate places for refugees to enjoy their rights. I mean, whether these rights are specifically refugee rights or basic human rights. And all urban areas, not only capital cities, are recognized as legitimate places for refugees and fall under the urban areas. And of course, UNHCR recognizes that this policy or the objectives of this policy will not be attained by UNHCR alone, but with effective cooperation and support from host governments, from city authorities, mayors, law enforcement, legislation bodies, and all partners. The last part and the presentation will highlight some issues related to refugees and the UNHCR 2009 policy. As mentioned before, half of the world's refugees are children. Many of them will spend their entire childhood away from home and sometimes separated from their families. And they would be exposed to protection risks, including violence, including exile, and the risk of abuse, neglect, and violence, besides exploitation in the labor market, trafficking, or recruitment in armed conflict. Fortunately, the refugee children are incredibly resilient. They can learn, they can cope, they are easier to cope, but still they require specific attention and special attention by UNHCR and other stakeholders. And needless to mention here, the pressure would be even greater in urban settings than camps. In camps, all refugees, all children are in one physical location. They can easily be identified and taken care of, or let's say easier. One of the protection risks face refugees in any setting is the issue of documentation. Refugees in urban areas are likely to come in a regular contact with a variety of official actors, including police, including inspectors at the workplace or in the marketplace, while they try to access services such as healthcare and education. Usually they will be asked to present documentation. And as we know, refugees in many situations, they lack documents or they lose documents during the journey of a flight from their countries. So the provision of documents attesting their identity and status and can play an important role in the prevention and finding solution to their protection problems. Documentation of children is one of the key highlights of this policy. So children born to refugee families or asylum seeker families are registered at birth and they are provided with documents. So each individual in the family is provided with an identity document, preferably by the host government, but if not, UNHCR will issue them a refugee card or an asylum seeker card. Unaccompanied and separated children require special attention because they lack the natural protection, the family protection, or the community protection. And in the urban setting, there is a greater risk of these children to be lost and to be exploited and to be subjected to abuse. In order to locate and protect those children, UNHCR works closely with national child protection agencies, other UN agencies, and NGOs, and law enforcement, and other relevant stakeholders in the country. Accessing to health care, education, and other services is also one of the challenges that faces children and other refugees in urban setting. As highlighted before, I'm skipping some slides because it was highlighted before. I don't want to repeat, but in here, so in all interventions, the policy and the practice addressing to ensure the access of children into the services provided by UNHCR and the partners, including accesses to the services already provided by the national governments. While providing material assistance to refugees, we recognize that usually the inability to meet the basic needs results in higher level of physical and mental illness, and sometimes due to lack of ability to provide for themselves, refugees might be prone or forced to be involved in illegal or illicit or degrading activities. That's why the provision of materials is a key of the interventions. And while doing that, UNHCR tries to ensure that children are also taken care and considered, and the assistance is providing in the way that allows children also to be part of the holistic care approach. That's all for my presentation. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'll be available to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Muaz. I think you covered quite a lot of ground there. So we'll come back to you with questions. I think we do have questions from participants. Reminding the participants again, if you have any questions to all the panelists, please write your questions on the Q&A sections. Yeah. Okay, so for the last presenter today is Gading Gumilang Putra from GRS. So Gading is the National Information Advocacy Officer at Jesuit Refugee Service Indonesia. He's been with GRS Indonesia since 2014 to provide assistance, service, and advocacy, including legal assistance to urban refugees. Gading graduated from Gajah Mada University in 2013, specializing in international law studies, and he had conducted several research, including about the legality of the detention process in Indonesia from the perspective of international law, and also about the handling of Syrian refugees from legal and political perspective. So, Mas Gading, the screen is yours.
Many thanks, Mbak Aquino. Can you hear my voice and video okay? Just want to confirm.
Yes, all good.
Okay. Allow me to share the screen. Okay, a very good morning to everyone, distinguished speakers and participants. I'm with GRS Indonesia, and thank you very much for the RDI UREF and SWACA for the opportunity given to us to share this morning. We'll be speaking a little bit about the NGO perspective and Indonesian context about refugee and urban management. GRS is a humanitarian and a Catholic faith-based organization with a mission of accompany, serve, and advocate on behalf of refugees and other forcibly displaced persons. And we use humanitarian approach that reflected by the diversity of our staff, volunteers, and people we serve. We started in 1999 in Kalang Island and continued our service on IDPs as well as on the disasters IDPs in Aceh, Jogja, Palu, and other parts in Indonesia. We started serving asylum seeker refugees in detention center, several detention centers in Indonesia while it was still the norms, and urban setting in Bogor and Jakarta. The highlight of this slide is that in 2021, just a few months ago, GRS Indonesia and RDI would have collaboratively conducted a stakeholder role play workshop on refugee management in urban setting, and we chose Bogor and surrounding town and surrounding area to Bogor town and its surrounding area to be the sample or the case study of that workshop. So a lot of different people comes at that workshop and they're playing roles as several agencies within the local government, the national government, NGOs, refugees, and others. Ideas is to see whether we can find any innovative solution ideas or whether we are or where we are at the moment. Bogor, because today I will be speaking about that, about the workshop and what we actually learned about it. But before that, I would like to provide a general context about Bogor. Most of the context has been explained very well from the national and regulation perspective by Dr. Annie previously and by Muaz from UNHRC Indonesia previously. So I will just highlight a little bit of it. So we just getting smaller a part of it. So Bogor is a town in Indonesia where 1,500 until between 1,500 and 2,500 refugees live in urban setting. And living with the local community in that setting often comes with also a challenge in Indonesia also, not necessarily the setting, but because of the Indonesian policy and the limitation. So it's including the rights and inclusion, which are limited, which is access to legal documents, livelihood, healthcare, education, and pathway to sustainable solution, including resettlement, mental health concerns, and others. Integration is inevitable in Bogor. For instance, like refugees still have to find a place, meaning that at some certain extent, they will still have to integrate anyway. Local shops and market when they need to buy stuff, and especially now with the COVID-19 situation where COVID doesn't differentiate. Often part of a negative stigma, heavily relying on humanitarian assistance, also part of the context in Bogor and maybe Indonesia generally. Resettlement remains to be the highest aspiration of refugees in Indonesia, and following by access to livelihood and rights to health. And this particular point we received it from our refugee consultation several times, and this is the main aspiration. Of course, there are other aspirations that I don't mention here. Current positive trend is that there has been President Regulation 2016's Regulation number 125, establishment of a government local task force in addition to the national task force mandated by the previous regulation I mentioned. Caring neighbors, growing numbers of refugee-led organizations, which is very, very good. An aspiration to have a more holistic regulation, as raised by Dr. Annie previously, and some civil society organization even felt concerned. Even the local government felt concerns about the regulation because it's not yet holistic. And possible alternative pathway to third country, although the number is very small, and potential for refugees to contribute to town or city. The last part is the entry point of the highlight of the workshop. So from that workshop, what did we learn? One, if given chance, refugee apparently can contribute to the local development and the city, if given chance. So the chance is very essential. Providing the chance to refugees are very essential. Allowing them to be the central of the policy rather than the perspective towards the city. I think it was mentioned on the keynote speech on the booklet of the event. Heavily relying on humanitarian approach, especially focusing humanitarian approach that has focus on specific aid should be reconsidered. It creates dependency and not sustainable in the long run. Especially with a very limited or often limited resources. So holistic perspective can be alternative, such as using case management approach, for example. Empowerment and participation is essential. we also strongly support, I mean, along with the refugee consultation, as we mentioned earlier, quite some numbers of refugees believe on economic resiliency and livelihood. A lot of people lost their youth and young ages in Indonesia for waiting. So refugee economic resilience and livelihood initiative would create more sustainable solutions. Involve refugees in designing and implementing the program could also help for everyone. Livelihood and skill training could also open more opportunity for durable solution beyond the traditional options, the three traditional options, especially, for instance, alternative pathway to the third country through education or through a job, for example. So, and meanwhile, for those who prefer to stay in, or do not have much option yet in Indonesia, they could still contribute to the city. However, the challenge is also is that the awareness. That's why we learn also that awareness, that multi-stakeholders collaboration. So yes, a collaboration is common term that we often use, and we all believe that this is good. However, how do we do it in local level? Because this is often the challenge, right? How do we do it practically? First, the awareness that multi-stakeholder collaboration is important, because often the awareness is not there. So between the national government, local government, think tank, refugee organization, and civil society organization. In the context in Bogor and Indonesia, often refugee management is pointed or given to one or two actors or stakeholders. Well, responsibility of refugees should go to this particular organization, or it should be taken by the national government, not the local one. And it just, creating a circle like that all the time. So we concluded awareness that everyone should sit together is not yet there. Even the refugees most often do not have a place to sit on the decision-making process, especially in the city planning. So interest often partial, and that creates interest often partial from any stakeholders, and sectoral, because we do not have understanding of the full context. We do not know what this organization can do and what they cannot do, and others. So collaboration, we felt that also, it can also broaden perspective to not only see refugee from only security perspective, which is the main narrative at the moment, or national perspective, which is also the main narrative, not the local perspective. Access for participation in decision making is often limited, and this is not only for refugees, even for the civil society organization or even for international organization, often limited. We learned that collaboration among local actors can actually have a lot mutual benefit for the city. Refugee participation is essential in the decision-making process and city management. This is what we believe. An avenue for creative ideas, innovation, context update, and ensuring collaboration should be supported, and it should be there. For instance, regular forum. Because how can we collaborate if we do not meet? How can we know each other if we never meet and talk to each other? So social integration is inevitable. Isolation, regardless it's called camp, maybe it's in urban setting, but with specific limitation on, space and freedom of, not freedom of expression, but it was meant to be a freedom of movement. It would create more challenges in the long run. And integration can also be fun. Culinary festival between the local and refugees, music festival. We conducted the culinary festival during Indonesian Independence Day in Bogor back then, and it was fun. And local people get to know refugees, refugees get to know local people, the policymaker get to know all of them. So it's no longer based on the prejudice when they are making a decision, but it's starting to move away to become a data-driven policy. The next one is humility. The sense of being humble to each other, understanding that the others might have a limit, but the others might also have potential. Awareness for ongoing learning process and data-driven policy, making the process important. City has its own context, and prejudice or stigma often has no factual basis or create worsening situation, especially if the policy based on a stigma. And last for me is that there are opportunities through Global Compact for Migration, Global Compact for Refugees, where Indonesia attend. And also there are some human rights cities. I think they do have some indicators in Indonesia, and it can create some sort of achievement to the city if they can reach that, right? There's also potential for collaboration for funds internationally. For example, if the local government has a limited access to that, or the national government has limited access to that. each stakeholder can play unique and essential role. First thing first is getting to know each other's stakeholders, what are their limitations and what are their potential. So it's not only those in the national context, but also local context. And we should not leave anyone behind on that collaboration. I thank you for the time. I give it over to you, Mbak Aquino. Very good morning, everyone.
Thank you very much, Mas Gading. I think that's quite a compact presentation. Yeah, and thank you as well for bringing up the workshop that we did. Just a bit of background information for everyone. So the workshop was actually aimed or targeting university students or new graduates, but also some practitioners. So it was quite an interesting mix of people because not all of them are familiar with refugee issues, and not all of them as well familiar with urban management or urban planning side of things. All right, so I think now we have about 20 minutes for question and answer. And I think there has been quite a lot of questions coming up, and some of the questions have been answered by David, actually. So thank you very much for that, David. I would like to invite Muaz and Pak Eni to maybe turn on their video. And I would like to start with a question to Pak Eni, actually. So there is a question here, Pak Eni, about the regulation, the Perpres 125 2016. Yeah, Pak Eni, can you hear me okay? I just want to make sure if yes. I think you're still muted, Pak. We still cannot hear you. You're still muted. Masih di mute, Pak Eni. Suaranya belum masuk, Pak. Wah. Mungkin mic-nya belum connect ya. Sorry, everyone. We'll just wait for a minute. Belum masuk, Pak Eni. Mungkin coba earphone-nya dilepas mungkin ya, Pak ya, atau colokan earphone-nya belum masuk mungkin ya. Okay, maybe while Pak Eni is trying to configure his mic, maybe I can ask the next question first to other panelists. Okay, we have here a question for Muaz and for Mas Gading. I think there are a lot of questions for UNHCR, so I'm gonna pick just one for starters. This is from Leticia. And she was asking about the position of UNHCR or maybe civil society as well in regards to education in urban areas. What is the position on your position on refugee education in urban areas in Indonesia, given the unique context? And here she mentioned that, because Indonesia is not a signatory to the convention, so the government is commended for making critical services accessible, including access to education. But many refugees actually prefers refugee learning centers because there's such a lot of or rich, diverse network in perhaps particularly in Bogor and Indonesia. So perhaps you can give some insights given the context of these two cities. Maybe I give it to Muaz first.
Sure, thank you for the question. It's really a very good question and comprehensive. But I believe probably Gading is the more expert in this subject, given GRC is our implementing partner for education. However, our position is definitely UNHCR is working closely with the government to ensure access of children into the national education system. There are more challenges, including integration among children and schools and some other challenges, I believe, guiding is able to highlight and more. But the position of UNHCR, of course, is to facilitate the access to those children in the national education system. If you'd like to elaborate more by guiding, please. I mean, it's your area, education.
Yeah, so GRS is providing these services as well, right? So perhaps Gading can elaborate a bit more on that.
Sure. Thank you, Mukas and Mbak Aquino. In regards to education in Indonesia, there has been a development actually. So the learning centers was started with the absence of regulation in Indonesia. It was started, I remember correctly, was in 2013, 2014, when the first refugee-led learning center or learning, the refugee-led learning center was started in Bogor to fill the gap. Lots of children not able to accessing education with the realization of the policy from Australia at that time regarding the boat, and people stay in Indonesia longer times. Now it's probably 10, 15 years, and children will lose their time for education, right? So the initiative to fill the gap on the ground is actually conducted by refugees, which is the refugee-led organization at that time. So this is what I meant earlier by that there are growing numbers from refugee initiative. However, later on the national level, there has been a circular letter from the Ministry of Education stating that refugee can access school with quite a lot of limitation, such as, I think in the year was 2018, the limitation such as no diploma, it cannot take any national budget. So there has to be a sponsor for that. Although generally, the school fee is free, but you know, for other supporting systems such as uniform and others. So there are two sort of ways in regards to education, and as I think the question earlier mentioned, there are different opportunity, right? Like in the local school, there are also some challenges there. In the learning center, which is a lot more localized, it has a lot more diversities and networks and others. Meanwhile, the policy of the formal education also quite different from one to another. And this is what I meant by collaboration is becoming more and more important. We shouldn't let like this, you know, two becoming becoming sort of challenging to one and another. But if there is a place in a city where they can actually collaborate, the local school might actually gain a benefit from the learning centers. Meanwhile, the learning center might also gain a benefit from the local school as well, especially with the social cohesion. We're seeing how the local children actually learn some language skill from, you know, from the refugee children or from some refugees, and also how the local can actually support the local community. So any access towards education, we are strongly support that. And currently what we're seeing is that the education initiative are filling the gaps that are still quite a lot of them are remaining. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mas Gading. So explore every avenues or every opportunities for access to education. I would like to try to go back to Pak Eni. Pak Eni, can you try to speak now? You're still muted, by the way, so you need to unmute yourself. Masih di mute, Pak? Masih di mute, Pak? Mungkin belum, nggak kedengaran, Pak. Mungkin colokan ininya sudah dicabut, Pak. Kemarin kayaknya dicabut terus kedengeran. Belum, Pak. Belum kedengeran. Well, this kind of technical problems usually also exist in webinars, so I hope for your understanding for this. Mungkin di settingan mic-nya, Pak. Ini sekarang masih di mute ya? Belum ada suaranya. Masih di mute. Okay. I'll come back to you again, Pak Eni. I'm very sorry, but let me try to ask another questions to other speakers first. I think
May I add on
oh yes,
on the
yes,
education?
yes.
Yeah. So,
Yes, please. Sorry. Yes.
Now, just a quick addition on the education that currently there are 28% of children at the age of school are already involved in national schools in Indonesia. 28% are already involved. And thank you, Gading, for talking about the issue of national number and ability of refugees to obtain the diploma. This is one of the challenges they face, their ability to obtain the diploma when they finish education. And I recall from the refugee perspective also, often they were not encouraged to engage in national schools because of the language barrier sometimes. However, for those who were born and lived in Indonesia for a long time, they speak Bahasa Indonesia and they are able to enroll in national schools. So that's it. Just wanted to add. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you, Muaz. Okay, while we're trying to connect with Pak Eni, no, we cannot still hear your. We still cannot hear your voice, Pak Eni. Nggak kedengeran, Pak. Mohon maaf, Bapak. Nanti kita coba lagi ya, Pak ya. So later we'll try again with Pak Eni. Now I want to move on to the next question. We have a question that actually David has already answered in the Q&A section, but I'd like to elaborate more a little bit about what the question is and the answer to that. So it's also related to the kind of relationship between refugee groups or community groups. So the question was that at the grassroots level, what kind of approach that we can do to educate or to persuade perhaps host communities to shift perspective and to take action and also make policies so that no refugees will be left behind. David, could you perhaps elaborate a bit more?
Thank you, Aquino, for that. And it's a great question. It's so difficult. At a level of humanity, I mean, we see amazing outcomes where people are warm, welcoming, generous, open, sharing. And I do happen to think that is a default in humanity, where people welcome others. That said, that's not always the case. And if there's competition for jobs or scarce resources or ethnic differences or, differences in whatever it may be, cultural understanding or a course in faith, then conflict can happen. And there's decades of experience when it comes to conflict resolution, how we do things together. In the chat, I replied to the question with the observation that city councils have a strong role to play in terms of policies that are welcoming and open and inclusive. And I'm English, but I live in Australia. I feel very lucky living in Sydney, which is a very peaceful and prosperous city and welcomes people. And the city authority takes great efforts to be welcoming on sort of welcoming Refugees Week and bus stops. You'll see posters and you'll see the rest. Now, this is a resource-rich, progressive city that's inclusive. Across the world, that's not always the case. But I do think it's that leadership which is important. And there is a big picture here. Of course, national governments have a role. But if we're talking urban, it's city authorities, it's city councils, often overlooked when it comes to policies that actually drive cities, the local mayors, and those people starting there. So both end, if you like. Gading, I couldn't help notice you nodding a lot there. Is that your experience as well, when it comes to authorities having to be crucial in this?
Yeah, perfectly, David. I perfectly agree with the city council, and I saw in different cities others. I remember my visit to Denver a few years ago, and they create this is something called Somali Tamale. It's a Somalian. It's a Somalians with also from the Hispanic community where they're actually meeting together with the locals as well, and the city council play a very strong role in that. And that actually can reduce conflict quite a lot in the long run, right? But the thing in Indonesia context, why I'm nodding so much, is that often the city council felt that they do not have, or they tend to be hesitant to create some sort of initiative, because any initiative would involve funds. And funds that is not regulated by the national government or national regulation tends to be like finding. And that finding is something that they are often, afraid. So this is something quite bureaucratic and quite difficult, but it's totally understandable. And for that reason, I strongly support on my presentation earlier to set up a collaborative forum, a regular forum, something that we can discuss about each other's challenges, including the local government challenges, because they do often maybe not necessarily have the security perspective only, but they just simply don't know how to do it because with the limitation that they have. And that's something that we all can support probably. Thank you.
Can I pick up on that, on what Mas Gading said about building alliances or collaboration between different city governments? I would like to get some insights from David, actually, because I think this kind of alliances between different cities are happening already in the Europe, for example, or in the Middle East, but I'm not sure how it is in the Asia Pacific region. So I would like to get some insight from you in terms of encouraging that kind of alliances between different cities to tackle this forced displacement issue, or at least to just sharing experience. What can we do?
Yeah, it is the discovery at that municipal level that there's a whole rich seam of connection. Of course, UN Habitat's been leading the charge on this for decades. I think there's an initiative called C40 as the 40 mayors. I could be wrong. But yeah, you're knowing it, which is very powerful. Some years ago, humanitarians kicked off, if you like, the Global Alliance for Urban Crises, which is very much at a municipal level. But that, just to reiterate, so they often, thank you for saying that, because they're often overlooked, it seems. And when we think government, we often think national. And of course, that's vital. And at the same time, it's city. And often cities are in opposition to the main government. I mean, around the world, that's very often the case. So, it's a real thing about how you work at a city level. As I say, Habitat 3, the agenda that came out from Quito in 2016, I think talks a lot about that. And others do too.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that's one of the, perhaps one of the agenda that we should kind of pursue a little bit more in the near future. Now, I'd like to, I think Pak Ani is still working on his mic, so I'd like to ask a question to perhaps Muaz and Gading. I think there are some questions coming in about the challenges to access livelihood and health as well for asylum seeker in Indonesia, and the impact of like the protracted situation to the refugees in Indonesia. So perhaps could you explain a bit more about how advocacy on this issue specifically is progressing in Indonesia?
Okay, thanks again for the question. So one of, as highlighted in the presentation, one of the challenges are facing urban refugees or refugees in urban area is the access to generating income activities and access to livelihood and their ability to take care and provide for themselves. This is a major challenge faced urban refugees globally. In Indonesia, still refugees are not formally allowed to access the labor market. However, advocacy with the government is still ongoing. There are alternative, in the meantime, we conducting several livelihood activities, mainly on building the capacity of SPOCs. Several programs are already running, including programs funded by the Australian government, by different UN agencies, and from other funds also. At this stage, we are focusing more on building the capacity of POCs, preparing them probably for future change in the national policy in terms of access to labor market, or building their capacity for the future if they are resettled in another country. So their time in Indonesia is not wasted. They can learn skills and probably they will use them in another country. There is recently we are working on a new initiative, which is Talent Beyond Borders. And this program is targeting on skilled refugees and asylum seekers to have an alternative pathways to resettlement based on their talents and the need and resettlement countries to target receiving refugees with specific talents, help them in the market in the resettlement countries. So briefly, this is the overview at the moment.
Okay.
If I missed something, let me know, please. Sorry.
Yes, perhaps Gading, you are a national advocacy officer, so you would probably have something to add on this.
In regards to the livelihood, I think UNHRC and IOM, for instance, and other NGO also conducting advocacy on livelihood for quite some times now. And of course, this is quite challenging for all of us to do that. But there are several updates and notes, especially from GRS. In regards to the update from national level, is that the National Task Force, which is the organization mandated, the agency mandated by the presidential regulation, mentioned that the letter has been sent to the Ministry of Employment. So in that regards, basically seeking for alternative or solution or regulations for refugee in particular to be allowed to access a livelihood or activities. Although it has some limitation, of course, but the process of that has been done on the national level. And the other part would be quite a lot of livelihood activities that not necessarily called as a formal work, such as a volunteering, where people can actually access maybe a little bit of funds so that they can support themselves, but not necessarily a sustainable job. However, this has a lot to do with skill increasing activities and designing program together. And this is where I leads to the GRS sort of approach on this. So one would be, we're trying to create 6 or 7 models on the local level between the refugees and the local. So collaboration with the local is very important on livelihood sector. And then we try to get that sort of a collaboration along with the local government and the national government to get that basically to showcase that as a good practices, because that's what the national I think that's what the national task force mentioned in the several forum, that livelihood is very important for refugees, and that's also for a pragmatic reason. For quite a long time, refugees stayed in Indonesia with a very limited support, and with a highly dependency on the humanitarian assistance. It will not be enough. And that's why we are seeing only, I think, the context in Indonesia, where thousands of people sleeping in front of the detention center, requesting to be detained, just so that they can access basic needs. And I don't think there is context like that in the other place in the world. So with also increasing mental health as well. So I think livelihood is inevitable, and based on the University of Gajah Mada research, I think they also mentioned that this is a pragmatic solution, and I think this is just inevitable. So we're just at the moment looking for models from the ground, because GRS is based on the field, so that we can use that as a good practices, so that when the government see that it can be used as a model, just like that. So quite similar with the education, and so quite similar also with the livelihood. That's the sort of the pathways that we are trying to use or apply. Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mas Gading. Muaz, you want to add something?
Yes, thank you, Gading, for touching on these important points. I just want to stress 2 more points. The first one is the main issue for access to livelihood in Indonesia is the lack of the legal framework. And this is what we are working on with the government. Another important point, which was highlighted in the presentation also, is that accessing to livelihood and self-reliance activities for refugees is actually the interest of the government as well, because there is a big part of refugees who are desperate, who do not have access to a means of support, and that could be a risk that some of them might be forced to engage in illegal or illicit activities. I'm not saying this is the case now, but there is a risk because of the desperation and need for support. Most of them, tiny percent of them is relying on the aid from the international community, which is insufficient and unstable, and it will never be sufficient to all refugees. And this is, of course, causes frustration and pressure and mental health and even psychological health, as mentioned by Gading. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Muaz. All right, we have limited time, very few minutes left. So I want to try to go back to Pak Eni. I think we have managed to connect to him through other channel. So Tessa, admin, can you please help? Hello, Pak Eni. Can you hear me?
Yes, I'm
Oh, yay, finally. Yes, we can hear you all right. Okay, Pak Eni, so this is the last question for this panelist, and I would like to touch upon the presidential regulation. As you know, the regulation has been there for about 5 years now, and so how do you perceive the regulation on this, the purpose, and also perhaps the coming regulations after that? How do you perceive it will progress in the near future? What is your insights or your, say, outlook?
It's a good question. It's very difficult question because the presidential regulation itself was enacted only 17 years after law number 37 that was enacted in 1999. Only 17 years, it was into class of textbook. It should have been enacted 1 year at the most. But again, as I said earlier, unfortunately, of course, the government has a very good intention, and purpose, the present regulation, so needs to be a very useful instrument to deal with operational, administrative, and technical handling of the asylum seekers and refugee process in Indonesia. That's what is lacking, is the absence of the policy on asylum seekers, on asylees, and on refugees. That is what is lacking. So, in answer to the question, there is no immediate and no practical solution to this, except by, of course, amending the regulation, the government regulation 135. But it does not answer the question, because what is needed by Indonesia is the implementation of the right to asylum as provided by the Constitution and by law on human rights. It takes time. Because it has to follow this procedure within the government itself, for the parliament. It takes very much time. I have really no answer to this question at this time. But the government, the presidential regulation, what that is now, it will not answer what is required by the Constitution. That is on the principles of policy on asylum refugees. So, well, of course, there is some possibility which is not very likely to be implemented, or that is the ratification of 1951 and 97 protocol. But because the law on ratification contains only 2 articles, which is the draft. But does the government really have the need, not the need, but the will, the intention to become party to this instrument? I'm sorry. Following the developments in 1981, I don't think the government is interested in joining this instrument.
All right.
So I do not have the answer to that.
Thank you, Pak Eni. But I think your points in terms of that, we need to amend or maybe expand a little bit more on the presidential regulation. The 125 regulation needs to be amended or needs to be added or maybe supported by other new regulations later on. I think that's one big homework that we have in Indonesia, and as well as perhaps, yes, it takes time for new regulations to come and even ratifying following the convention is perhaps very kind of far away from now, but you know, there are opportunities, I suppose, on that. So anyway, I think we have come to the end of this panel discussion. There are still many questions that has not been answered, but I think we can post the answers and your comments later on our social media. I would like to thank you very much for all speakers for this very, very interesting and engaging discussion this morning. And also thank you very much for all participants who come to this panel and stay for about 1.5 hours. I do really hope that you enjoy the discussion like I did. And also, I want to remind you on the attendance and feedback form. If you haven't filled it out, please spare 5 minutes of your time to do so. We, as I mentioned before, we will also share responses from the speakers to the questions and comments that haven't been responded to in this panel, and we'll share that through our social media channels. So do follow us in any of those platforms. Again, a reminder to check out the opening plenary in our website to watch welcoming remarks and keynote speeches. And lastly, I would also like to give a shout out to the team behind the screen for the amazing support today. And thank you very much also to have explored avenue to include or to reach out still to connect to Pak Eni with the difficulties. I really appreciate Pak Eni as well for staying with us until the end of this panel. And on the behalf of the organizing of the panel organization committee, I would like to apologize for any technical problems and inconvenience today. So once again, on behalf of the organizer, I would like to thank you very much for your attendance today and also enjoy the rest of the conference. Cheers.